coming today. My name is Madeline Skloss, and I'm the president of this Mystic Institute chapter here at Texas A&M. Thank you all for joining us today. So our TI chapter was founded in the fall of 2020, and it exists to promote Catholic truth in our contemporary world by strengthening the intellectual formation of Christians at universities, in the church, and in the wider public square. The thought of St. Thomas Aquinas, the universal doctor of the church, is our touchstone. To do this, we bring in speakers from other universities who are well-versed in Thomistic philosophy, and we hold weekly reading groups that center on philosophy and theology. Today's speaker, Father Anselm Ramelow, is a Catholic priest in the Order of Preachers, which is the same order that St. Thomas Aquinas belonged to. He is currently a professor of philosophy at the Dominican School of Philosophy and Theology in Berkeley, California, and is the chair of the philosophy department there. He holds a PhD in philosophy from the University of Munich, and his dissertation was on the topic of Leibniz and the Spanish Jesuits. I unfortunately cannot pronounce the actual title of his dissertation, as it is in German. He also regularly teaches courses on modern philosophy and theology, covering Kant, Hegel, Kierkegaard, Wittgenstein, Heidegger, and others. He continues to work on questions of free will, the philosophy of religion, and philosophical aesthetics. We will have an opportunity for a Q&A session following the talk. Now, please join me in welcoming Father Anselm Ramelow for his talk, AI and the Soul, Can Computers Be People Too?
Well, thank you for the introduction. Thank you for inviting me. And it's a big topic that's on many people's minds. What can computers do with ChatGPT? And there are a lot of questions around that, including ethical questions. I'm actually in a work group for the Vatican. The Vatican actually wants to say something on the topic. It's the first time that the church may say something on technology in a larger sense, too. I'm not going to talk about the ethical questions tonight, though, at least not much, but more really what computers are. That is, not what they can do, but what they are. For example, can they be conscious? Can they be people, persons? Do they have a soul, perhaps? These kind of questions are not entirely new. The human imagination has often thought about these things. In fact, Albert the Great, another Dominican, is said to have built a robot already in the 13th century. That may be a legend, but people thought all sorts of things at that time, and at least they had the fantasies and the imaginations about that. Of course, we have Frankenstein's monster. That's are also things we have known for a long time. And the Jewish tradition has the golem, not from Lord of the Rings, but this is a figure made out of clay, and they put on a piece of paper the name of God in the mouth of this, not machine, but fabrication. It tells you now you have to put the name of God into the mouth to make something really a person, something in the image and likeness of God. Now that, of course, too, was science fiction of its own age, but they raised some similar questions around that already at that time. Let me just put this away here. But how would we even begin to think about that? People see that we can make all these kind of simulations that look so lifelike, and machines talking to you. How can we even distinguish? How can we discern that? Now, there have been and still are some human intuitions that we have around that, although I'm worried that they increasingly evaporate too. But if you take one of the fathers of that, Alan Turing, he, in his famous article, lists a number of these kind of things that we believe. So, for example, what computers cannot do, he says, be kind, resourceful, beautiful, friendly, have initiative, have a sense of humor, tell right from wrong, make mistakes, fall in love, enjoy strawberries and cream, make someone fall in love with it, learn from experience, use words properly, be the subject of its own thought, have as much diversity of behavior as a man, do something really new. Now, in that list, a lot of things you may debate, and some of these things may already be outdated. There's a movie, where a machine does make somebody fall in love with it, and things like that. But still, I mean, have you ever been tempted to apologize to your computer? Now, I recently used ChatGPT, and at the end I wrote, "Thank you." And I said, "You're welcome," and any time, so to speak. But the reason why I wrote that is because initially it says this system will be monitored for performance and upgrade and so on. There's a real human being looking at that. And so I better be polite. One of our fathers always says "thank you" to Alexa, because he says when the robot apocalypse comes, he wants to be the machine on his side. Have you been ever tempted to tell your computer a joke? I think still most we would not do that. We would, because we don't believe there is a there, to appreciate a joke. So I mean, we still have some of these intuitions. What do we do with a self-driving car that kills a person? Would we put that car on trial? If we believe that it's a person like us, that's what we should do. Do we feel remorse when we turn our computer off, thinking we just killed someone? We still don't do that. I mean, we don't think that. So some intuitions are still intact, and that is very good. Because if you really would believe that, and you would think of computers like us, and you can, without remorse, turn the computer off, what can you do with human beings? That, for example, are in a vegetative state, end of life. There are real ethical concerns there. And we also should notice that the belief that there may be a person or something that has nothing to do with intelligence, I mean, talk about artificial intelligence, it doesn't have anything to do with IQ, it does not have to do with performance. Machines outperform us all the time. I mean, cars go faster than we can go on our own, right? Computers can do calculations much faster than we can do. If that were so, there would be more persons than we are. I don't think, again, personhood, consciousness, self-consciousness has anything to do with performance in that sense, or the kind of intelligence that we think about. But they can certainly simulate a lot of our behavior, increasingly so. But we should still be aware that any simulation is still that. It's a simulation. A simulation, by definition, is not the real thing. And it's not that you make a simulation better, that it becomes the real thing. It's a better simulation. That is, it is more simulation, not less. And so there's no approximation or any way where you go beyond the line just because the simulation gets better. It is, again, as I said, it's not about doing or simulated doing. It is about being. What really is it? And the way to approach that, I want to suggest is, first of all, why would we assume that a material thing has mental states? And I think very much we have been trained to think of ourselves already in terms of computers. We think of our brain as the organ of thought, and I will tell you later why that cannot be the case. We think of the brain as a carbon-based computer, perhaps, and things like that. And so it's all analogous to that. And if you replicate that, of course, then the machine can think too. But we already then have assumed that our mental states also are nothing but material kind of functionings in our brain. And what I'm going to do now is just to show you why we cannot think about ourselves that way. I think once we have come to see that, we have shifted the burden of proof. Nobody thinks you need anything mental in a computer to explain why it works the way that it does. I mean, an engineer can explain that to you, and we are taking pride in that we can do that. That is an additional assumption, and the question is, why should we assume that? In our own case, we have reasons to assume that because we know our own mind. And so I will give you, first of all, reasons to think about ourselves again in a way that, for example, Thomas Aquinas would have thought about, and not to reduce ourselves to physical states, including the brain. I will go through a number of things, and if I run out of time, then we'll just drop some of the steps. The first one is fairly well known from the philosophy of mind when people talk about qualia, as they call that. Qualia, they use here quality in that. This is about the quality of how it is to be in a mental state, how to experience certain things. For example, the way that heat and cold feels. The way in which that is for you to experience that. The way red looks. The way a rose smells. The way a clarinet sounds. The way coffee tastes. Or the experience of pain. We don't assume that a computer has pain, for example. And for ourselves, too, pain is something we experience. We know how that is. And nobody looking at us will see that pain. That is something interior to us. Our mental states are something interior to us that in a way are private. I cannot look into your mind in the way that I can look into your brain. And if you see red or you hear the clarinet sound and somebody opens your skull and looks at your brain, well, the brain is not going to sound like a clarinet, right? And if you see something red, nothing in your brain is turning red. Where is that experience in that material object? Thomas Nagel, who has thought about that a lot, suggests if somebody eats chocolate ice cream and you lick at his brain, the brain is not going to taste like chocolate, right? So where is that state? Where are those qualia? Where are these ways in which it is like to be in that state? There's no little TV screen in your brain that shows you that. And it's not that by microscopes you would find that or something just digging deeper. It's just not there. It's nothing material, and therefore it doesn't show up under any microscope or any other kind of device. Our brains remain gray matter, even if we see red. And that would be true, I suggest, not just for us, but also for animals. Animals are actually more than computers. There was a conference on human uniqueness at MIT, where I gave the talk on the artificial intelligence part, but there was also one on animals and human beings. And it's interesting, the students at MIT were quite convinced that we were more than animals, but they were not so sure about computers. And I think our intuitions should be the reverse. Of course, animals are more. There's a real there if your dog looks at you and is happy, to see you or something like that. The computer doesn't do that. But so an animal will have pain states, for example, and that's why we don't treat animals cruelly. Whereas I don't have a qualm, taking my computer mouse and throwing it in the trash. Call it a mouse, but it isn't. So these are subjective states that we know in a first-person perspective. We know our own states, others don't. If you go to the doctor and I say, I have a toothache, and the dentist looks at that and says, no, your tooth is perfectly fine, you don't have pain. I say, well, I must know better whether I'm in pain or not, right? I mean, even if it's hallucinated pain, it's still pain, right? That's this kind of sense of qualia that we have, the subjective states. And there are personal to us and in a way private. Nobody can see that from the outside. Whereas material things you can see from the outside, just as your brain. Another aspect that comes with our consciousness is that our consciousness is a unified field. So right now, you're sitting in this room, and you are aware of many things. You hear my voice, you hear the people talking outside, you hear the air conditioning perhaps, you see chairs and windows and everything else. There's a whole kind of field that is unified. It is unified by being in your consciousness, in your mind. All of these are things that you are aware of. Kant talks about the I think that accompanies all these kind of phenomena and therefore unifies it. Of all of them, it is true that I have these and I am aware of them. And in that field, I can migrate around. I mean, I have a periphery, my vision, for example, and I have a focus, and I can shift that from one to the other. And that is very much a feature of consciousness. And that also is not something yet you can simply find in matter. Where, for example, would all of that be? Nothing in your brain exemplifies that. I mean, you look in your brain, what even makes your brain one, right? There may be many neurons firing at the same time, sort of orchestrated perhaps, you know, but that is not itself a unified kind of thing, and there's not an awareness of that because nobody's aware of my brain right now. I'm not either, right? You don't see any of that just by looking at the brain. And that is something that people have discussed already for a while. In the 17th century, you have some first mechanistic kind of materialists and likely atheists like Thomas Hobbes, you know, who thought similar things to what we think about brains today frequently. And Leibniz, you mentioned Leibniz, part of my doctorate. Leibniz says, well, if that were so, you could take our brain and just, you know, make it larger, make it as large as a windmill, he says, and you can go in there and you see all the wheels turning and so forth, all the things that Hobbes imagined. But he says you wouldn't see anywhere anything like a perception. I mean, not the qualia, but also not the unified kind of thing that it is. It's just cogs on wheels and they're parts, but how exactly do they form a whole? You know? So those things have been observed already for a while. And again, this is, first of all, just talking about us. And of course, it's true also for computers. In a computer, you don't see any of these things either. But it tells us, first of all, we cannot be materialists about our own mind. These unified kind of features show up in many kind of contexts. For example, if you hear a melody, right? A melody, in order to hear it as a melody, you have to hold together over time. It forms one gestalt, if you want. You know, it's a unified thing. It's not just one note after another. Even the very notes themselves, the way you hear an individual note depends on what is around it, where it comes from, and what you expect to come next, and how you're surprised by the next note. That is, you hear that in a unified field, even in terms of time. If you speak, you know, and you formulate sentences, you know, you are at some place and you anticipate where you are going, and you have to hold that together with what you have said before, otherwise you say grammatical nonsense, and so forth and so on. So that is a very fundamental feature of our mind, and that would be a challenge to a materialist to answer how that could be a material feature. The next point is what people call intentionality. And intentionality is meant in a broader sense than usually it is used in English, where we think of having the intention to do something, practical intentionality. That is intentionality too, but even our cognitive states have that. So it is always this consciousness of something. I remember something, and don't just remember as such. I see something, I imagine something, I anticipate something. And indeed, I intend to do something. So all of these are intentions. They are intent on something, we might say. As a kind of an aboutness in the mind. The mind is about something. It is conscious of something. That is something that the phenomenologists have rediscovered in the 19th and early 20th century, but you do find elements of that already in Thomas Aquinas, and some of them actually quote that. Now, to illustrate that, by contrast with material states. So, material causality. Classical example, people like to think of are billiard balls. You know, there's one picture I wanted to draw. Let's say you have billiard ball A, and then you have billiard ball B, and it bumps into the next billiard ball, right? And then maybe into billiard ball C, and then you have the time trajectory, and it's going on and on and on. That kind of causality, Aquinas would call that efficient causality, is very familiar to us, and that is what we typically think of and imagine. And that is true, But you have billiard ball A and billiard ball B. Now, is billiard ball B aware of billiard ball A that bumps into it? Does it say, ouch, perhaps? Does it have qualitative states? Or is it intent on avoiding the billiard ball or whatever? Or just simply perceiving that it is being bumped into? No, because it's a material thing. But what would it mean for the billiard ball to be aware of that? If billiard ball A and B, one bumps into the other, that's causality. Billiard ball B, if it were aware of billiard ball A, that would go this direction, right? That's causally upstream. Yeah? And that is not something physical, right? Physical is that, but intentionality, what the mind is doing by being aware of what causes something in the recipient, that is not something physical. And so that's the phenomenologists have pointed that out, that that's one of the reasons to think that mind isn't the same as matter. So this kind of aboutness is not a case of physical causality, even though it takes both. So if I see something, of course, there is something causally impacting my retina and then goes through the nervous system and processed in the brain, and then whatever else happens for mind to be there. But that's the causal aspect for perception. But in every perception, there is also the contrary direction, because I am aware of it. I perceive something that affects me in that way. But it is the opposite direction. So it's a very unique kind of relation. And it is these kind of aspects that Thomas Aquinas, for example, will talk about as final causality. And beginning in the early modern age, when the more materialistic kind of conceptions of nature and others were developed, they polemicized against that. They thought there's a form of animism or something superstitious or something. No, it just means what I explained to you, which is a very simple and fundamental kind of experience. But what that led to is to say the physical world out there doesn't have any of that. These are merely subjective states that we may project out on reality, they thought. That includes, for example, qualia. He's talked about the perception of red. Descartes, Galileo, Newton, and so forth, they don't think the world is colored. That's a merely subjective experience. And so they said, here's the real world, the physical world, and then you have these secondary qualities, as John Locke called that, and that's merely subjective, and that's the big rug under which we sweep all these kind of phenomena, these mental kind of things that I'm describing to you. And they don't exist out there. Well, that leads, of course, to a certain problem, because if then you say, our mental states are just physics, brain physiology, then, well, where do you, you're trying to sweep the rug that you have developed as the merely subjective under the same rug, right? You try to sweep the rug under itself. You cannot do that, right? But if as soon as you're aware of that we have these mental states, regardless of what we think about the physical world, first of all, I may come back to that, it means you cannot reduce that to these kind of physical mechanisms by their own premises. That's what philosophers have tried to say, but it doesn't work. Now, these intentional states have to do with perception, practical intentions. They also have to do with emotions, with affective states. If you love, you always love someone or something, right? Hence, can computers fall in love, right? It was Alan Turing's kind of question. And can bits and pieces and chunks of matter fall in love with other bits and pieces and chunks of matter? What would that even mean? All of this also affects our body. Raymond Tallis, who's a neurosurgeon actually, and has written a lot about these things. He's an atheist, but he's actually quite good on these things. He says that our awareness of things gives us a kind of a mental space in which we also can respond to things. And that response is spreading out over our whole body. It says, there is an intentional space of possibilities that spreads over the whole body like a blush. An interesting kind of image, you know. So the body has also an emotional response, it has an affective response, but also all of our sensations. If I touch, you know, this podium, my touch is actually not in my brain. I experience that in my finger, right? My intentionality, my awareness is spread out through the whole body. And that means my body is alive. It is a living body. Computers don't blush. You know? They don't, this is not an embodied kind of intentionality. And much of our awareness or cognitive awareness of things and of intentionality goes through the body, and people have talked about that a lot. I mean, embodied cognition, for example. But first of all, before it even does something, it makes our body simply alive. It's a living body and not a machine. That doesn't prevent us from talking about computers analogously. For example, we say, my computer tries to connect to the printer, right? That's an intentional kind of thing, right? You try to do that. We talk about missiles that seek heat, right? Heat-seeking missiles. Do they seek something? Well, that's an intentional state, right? We say a computer detects key presses, you know, or tries to initialize something, or searches for available devices, or they take things to be the case, or trying things, or monitoring things. All of these are intentional states. That's our way of talking about computers, but computers don't actually have these states. The reason why we talk that way is because we have made these computers as our tools. And any tool is sort of an elongation of my embodied intentionality. So I mean, even animals can do that. An ape, you know, can take a stick to get a banana, right? That is an elongation, literally, of the arm, the embodied intentionality of the arm that would want to grasp the banana, right? Telescopes, you know, are an elongation of the intentionality of our eyes that try to perceive something in the night sky. And because of that, they share, in a way, in our intentionality. That's what they are made for, and that's why we are talking about it that way. But it is, at the end, always our intentionality that we see embodied there. It's not literally there, but it is because we made it for our purposes. And because it is not literally there, Alan Turing says they cannot make mistakes. If you, it sounds strange, right? I mean, you think a computer can make mistakes too, perhaps ChatGPT does that. But in order to make a mistake, you have to try to do something, right? It's the to fail to do something that you're trying to do. But the computer doesn't try anything, literally speaking. In that sense, a computer cannot make mistakes, literally. Daniel Dennett, do you know Daniel Dennett? It's one of these famous apocalyptic writers, the four atheists, you know, Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, and what's his name, Richard Dawkins, and so forth. And so he is a materialist of that sort, and he calls it the intentional stance. We read that into things, but they're not literally there, right? Now he thinks we also read that into human beings, that even we don't have intentional states. And he thinks that's sort of a mythology of mental states that don't actually really exist. All that you have are brain states. It's just that we interpret it that way. Now that's a very strange thing to say, because if we interpret it that way, what does it mean to interpret something? What does it mean to have a stance of that sort? That's itself a form of intentionality. Where does that come from? Who is reading that into us? God? I mean, So if it doesn't stop with us, then there isn't any there. So I mean, we have these intentional states, and we do read it into that. And for once, he is right about that when it comes to computers. But to say that about ourselves leaves you nowhere, basically. Again, I think that also is something that animals have. And again, the animals are more than computers in that regard. So a dog really is hungry and has a desire for food. It has an intention to find food and to eat it. So I think that we can take that to the obvious. But there is something about this intentionality that is another interesting feature. And that is negativity, absence. What is an absence? I mean, that is, if a dog desires food, the food isn't there, right? It experiences the absence of something. So having these kind of intentional states is the condition for us to talk about absence and therefore negativity. And these are not themselves physical states. Absence isn't the physical thing, right? What makes it true that there is no elephant in this room? I mean, not the elephant isn't there, right? And whatever you may say about that, empty space or something, it's already presupposing a lot of things. But whatever that would be, how is it different from what makes it true that there is no kangaroo in this room? It can only be relative to what we are looking for. If I'm looking for an elephant, then I experience the absence of the elephant. But if I'm looking for a kangaroo, I'm experiencing the absence of a kangaroo. But it is always related to states of intentionality, like seeking something or imagining something. Any image, if you imagine something, is something that, in a sense, is there, but also is not there. If you imagine an elephant, it's not literally there. So you have both absence and presence in what makes for an image. And that also has to do with intentionality. Or if you think of memory, you can remember what you did yesterday, but of course that's not the case anymore now. Right? It's not there anymore. And the question is, how would you put that into a computer? We talk about computer memory all the time, right? But what does memory in a computer mean? It's a material kind of state in the computer, but we interpret that particular state as referring to something that's not there anymore. The not there anymore is not something in the computer, because in the computer are only material states, and material states are always there, right? They're always something positive. Negativity is indeed the absence of such states, if anything, right? So what makes for negativity? And you can take a plus and a minus sign, right? And if you write them on a board, as I would have done, you would have chalk marks, right? And they're both positive material things, right? What makes one negative and the other positive? Something in our mind that interprets it that way, just as we would do with computer states, right? Now, it's an interesting feature, as you know, double negative makes for positive, right? So you can get from these negativities that our mind can perceive or construct back to positivity. But you cannot do the opposite. A double positive doesn't make for a negative. Now, anything that's material is positive. It's there, right? You can never get from something purely material to the thought of something negative. That's only something mental, right? And so only with a mind do we open up the space for something to be negative in the first place. That may be interesting because, in computers you have all these things with 1 and 0. They're actually not literally there on the computer either. I mean, Alan Turing talks about that. The discreteness that something as opposed to nothing has doesn't really exist in the machine either. And it doesn't need to be there either. It just you can interpret anything, any kind of voltage or something like that in relation to the other as representing that, just as the chalk mark of plus and minus on the board can represent that. But it's not literally there in the computer. Even the 1 and the 0 isn't. So, next thing, and I know I'm going through a whole number of things, but I want to see, how many problems there are if we want to think that matter can be aware and conscious and all that. But it's related to intentionality, and it has to do with language and the semantics of language. Language is about something. It means something. It represents something. I want to make you aware of something by using words. So the words refer to something. That's what we call semantics. And there's a famous argument by John Searle, a Berkeley philosopher, the so-called Chinese room argument. Maybe you have heard about that. It often shows up in undergrad courses. It's a good argument, and it's worth recalling that. And in its simplest form, and people have, of course, made variations of that, you imagine sitting in a cabin of some sorts, and there's one slit on one side and one on the other side, and you are asked to translate something from, say, Chinese into Polish, right? And so on one side, somebody slides a Chinese character into your little cabin, and you have a table by which you can compare that and say that matches that, and then you slide out the Polish word on the other side. Do you understand what you have translated? Presuming you don't know Chinese and Polish, right? You only have matched one with the other, right? You don't know the semantics of the words. You don't know the meaning, right? A computer can do what you just did. It can match one with the other. And I know translation programs are very different today from that, but that was originally what they did. And that's really what's at stake here, first of all. You, in any case, just process something to something else, whether it's pattern or words and so forth. And it doesn't give you the semantics. That has to do with the interpretation of these words as being about something, this intentionality. And you don't need for the computer to function to be able to do that. But we are aware that we haven't understood a thing about what we have just, put through the slit. You may hear people laughing on the other side, and oh, this was just a joke I passed through. Or people screaming, and that was actually an insult or something. But you still don't know what the joke was. And so that, too, we wouldn't assume about a computer because it depends on intentionality. That is what affects also some of the terms we use talking about computers, like information. Information is information about something. And there are computer states that we read as referring to something and being information about the world, just as our sound waves that I make, or the written words that we have don't by themselves refer to that. You have to learn these words, especially if it's a foreign language. They don't do that by themselves. And so likewise, the computer states that we call information mean something only because we read it into these states. There's not literally information in the computer, just as there's not literally memory in the computer. All of these things we do say, and it's important to be aware that that already is a metaphorical way of speaking or a projection that we make into the computer. So otherwise, we already have anthropomorphized, if you want, the machine. Okay, let me do two more things if I can. So all of these aspects we share with animals. Animals have experiences, they have memories, they have intentional states, and so forth. What they don't have are universal thoughts. Animals don't make theories about something in the way that we do. They don't formulate equations for laws of nature. These are universal descriptions of how things behave. These are laws. Universality occurs already if I just use words like dog, right? A dog, there are many dogs in the world, and there are poodles and German shepherds and everything else. And they're all dogs. You know? So dog is a universal term, right? And it's not just Fido or Rex, but it's all the dogs that have existed in the past, that exist now, that exist in the future, and even those that never exist, possible dogs, right? All those that could exist. All of these are dogs, imaginary dogs. And so what does it mean that we have the ability to form concepts like that, universal concepts? I said earlier, and if you look into your brain, you don't see anything turning red or something like that. Well, let's say you open your brain, and lo and behold, maybe dog is written on your brain or something like that. You know, it says, oh, lo and behold, there are, you know, my universal terms, there are in the brain after all. Well, not so. I mean, even if it were written in the brain, which it isn't, that would be just another state of matter. The mere writing in the brain is something material and therefore not universal. Everything material is particular. Every real dog, Fido and Rex and whatever, you know, is a material dog and therefore a particular dog. And so nothing material can be universal as such. So if I have a universal thought, then that already means my mind is not material. There's something in my mind that transcends matter. And that is why Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas say that the brain is not the organ of thought, which is contrary to what most people think, you know. You think, oh, my brain doesn't work, I cannot think of something. Well, there is some truth about that. You know, people say immediately, okay, if I didn't have my coffee, I cannot think straight, you know, or if I have too much alcohol and so forth. That's true, but it's true because the brain provides indeed some important input. You know, Thomas Aquinas and Aristotle do say that all of our experience, all of our knowledge begins from the senses and they're processed in the brain. That is true. But it doesn't stop there. The thought about this input is not what the brain is doing. The brain is just giving you the material to think about. And that is why, you know, drugs and something that mess with our brain also prevent us from thinking straight. It provides a necessary condition for our thought, but not a sufficient one. To be a sufficient condition for thought, we have to have something that's not material, as I said earlier. Our thoughts, our universal thoughts, are not material, and that cannot have a material organ. Now, eyesight has, you know, eyeballs and things like that. It has a material organ, but not my thought, because it has this feature of being universal. Another way of saying that is maybe taking a bit more from Plato. And again, I would have drawn a circle here on the board, right? Imagine I did that. And it most likely would not be a very perfect circle, right? What does it mean to say this is not a perfect circle? It means that we compare the really drawn circle, the particular circle on the board, with our notion of circularity. So the material thing already cannot quite match the precision that our thoughts have. Nothing material can do that, not our brain, not the board, nor anything else. That's the first point. Now let's say I managed to draw a really, really, really perfect circle, right? So, but even then, is that our notion of circularity? Does it even represent that? Not really. It's just one circle. You could make many circles of the same kind all over the board, and they're all circles. The universal thought would cover all of them, not just this particular one. So even this particular perfect circle is not what makes for circularity. Now, I could make infinitely many of these circles and still not reach that goal because there are many circles with different diameters, right? How many circles with how many different diameters are there? Infinitely many. I can never draw all of these. None of these. I mean, if you cannot, by a physical thing, instantiate what our thought is. You know? It transcends matter. And not because it's too diffuse or something. It's a very precise notion that we have if you think circularity. Geometry is a very precise science. And but matter will never suffice to represent that or make it present. And whenever you make it into a material image, it will be a particular and not a universal. So this is to say, there are many ways in which our mind then transcends matter in all cases, and even beyond what animals can do. There are more things I wanted to do about that, but I'll just pass that by and come to one more point. And we can pick these things up, of course, in the discussion later. Among the universal thoughts that we can have are some that are really, really universal. So if you take the thought of everything, it's a very peculiar thought to think of it. You try to think everything. The thought by which you think everything, is that part of everything? Yes, it's another thing, right? So the thought of everything contains itself. That's a very peculiar kind of thing, right? And it's actually a rather paradoxical feature in many ways. But it has to do with reflexivity. It's a thought that can reflect on itself and contain itself at the same time. It can. So the intentionality I talked about, it means itself, among other things. And we do that all the time, namely when we say I to ourselves. And there's the question, can computers become self-conscious even eventually? It's the difference between consciousness and self-consciousness. This is even a higher level. And only rational beings, Aquinas would say, have that kind of reflexivity that you can say I to yourself. Little children actually don't do that from the outset. They often refer to themselves in the third person. So at a certain age that they awaken to that. But it is a paradoxical kind of thing. I mean, to say I to yourself means you're stepping outside of yourself to address yourself. Right? You mean yourself, and yet also you distinguish yourself from yourself at the same time. And that leads to some paradoxes, such as the liar paradox. Maybe you know the liar paradox. So St. Paul even quotes that somewhere. The Cretan says all Cretans are liars, right? Well, if the Cretan says that, is that statement true or false? Is he lying or not? But if he's lying, then he's not lying. And if he's not lying, then he's lying, right? That's paradoxical. You can make that even simpler and can say, this sentence is false. Is that sentence false or is it true? Well, the problem arises because the sentence refers to itself in a way that we perhaps do with our mind. Maybe you shouldn't allow sentences to do that. But for the liar's paradox, it certainly would be the case, because a liar talks about himself in that case. I am lying now. What does that mean? And so it's a paradoxical kind of structure, and the question would be, can a machine do that? Can a machine reflect on itself? Can a machine contain itself? Can anything material contain itself? That would be like putting a briefcase into itself, right? A very strange thought in a way, but shows you that you can have parts of matter being about other parts of matter. Maybe you have an algorithm that manipulates another part of the machine, and it is part of the machine, but not the whole thing. So if you have that, you can say that's a material thing, a piece of paper. And I can say I take this part, and it's supposed to reflect on this part and manipulate it in some way. So I can fold that. So you have one half on the other, but maybe it's just this part and that. That is not the kind of reflection that we do if we say I to ourselves, because we refer to the whole of ourselves, not just a part. Of course, you can try to approximate that, and you keep folding the paper. But how often do you have to fold this paper in order to have every part of the paper touch every other part? Or at least one part touching all the other parts. Yes, well, that was the starting point. How often have to fold that? Infinitely many. Infinitely many times. And what do you get at that point? A point. A geometrical point. And what's the extension of a geometrical point? Zero, nada, nothing, right? It's therefore not something physical. Everything physical material is extended in space. And so nothing material can do that. And reflexivity, and that is a form of reflexivity, depends on that. And if you allow me to say two things more on that. So this has to do with the question of whether computers can upgrade themselves and lead to the singularity and things like that. We can upgrade ourselves, we can be creative because we can take a step back from what we are doing and envision ourselves new. But a computer cannot literally do that, and you can challenge me on that if you want, But from what I can see, whatever a computer does, it does with some kind of an algorithm, and this ultimate source code that it has, it cannot reflect upon or upgrade. So there's a lot that hinges on this point. And then the second point on that is, I said it's a point. It's a very, the thought of I is a very simple thought. Even people with Alzheimer's still know what I means, even if they've forgotten who they are otherwise. That's part of what self-consciousness is. And that is a simple point. And I want to make that point because people often talk about, well, if you just build machines that are complex enough, then they will develop consciousness. But the point is, it's not about complexity, it's about simplicity. A point is something simple. It's at the root of this unified field of consciousness that I talked about. And that spreads over our body. That makes it one. That's, you need a simple point to unify something else. Machines are, it's not the problem that they're not complex enough, they're not simple enough. And that's, I think, something that goes constantly wrong in discussions. But I want to stop here and keep talking because for Plato, for example, simplicity is one of the reasons why our souls are mortal, right? And they cannot fall apart like matter can fall apart. That leads to theological questions we can debate tomorrow if you want. But so this is just to give you a range of just thinking about why mind and matter are different. And if you see that for ourselves and you see that computers can be explained just materially, there's no reason why we should attribute that to computers. And now I really stop. There's always more, but yeah. Thank you.
Okay, so we will now have time for a Q&A session. Please keep your comments short, and we will limit it to one question per person.
Yes, please.
So what about dreams?
I cannot hear you. There's some machine going here.
What about dreams?
Dreams.
Computers can't dream. I don't know if animals can dream. But
Oh, well, they do. Ever had a dog? I mean, they're running in their sleep, right? Oops. Yeah.
like, is that another example of how computers are not human? Or also, like, why do we dream?
How do we dream? That's our imagination. So our external senses are suspended. You don't know what's going on outside of you. And imagination is one of the interior senses. So like memory, fantasy, I mean, there's active imagination, there's passive imagination. And dreams, it's the passive one. That's what we share with animals. we can also creatively imagine new things. Presumably animals are not that creative on that, they're not active. But associations that converge in our passive imagination, that's what happens in dreams. So earlier influences from the day and so forth will mix with other things. And but it's a little free-floating because it's not hinging on external things by our senses, nor is our mind active to discern that properly. You know, that's, we cannot think straight in dreams either. You know. Does that make sense? Yeah. Yes, please.
Earlier you were talking about the unified field of awareness we have in terms of sense experience. We see, hear, feel things at the same time, though we may not be focusing on it at the moment. I think maybe we can also include in that, and maybe you said intellectual ideas. So my question is, what psychic organ or psychological organ in us attends to the thing that we decide to focus on? So tangentially aware.
I'm not tangentially aware of that. Can you say the last thing, this last sentence again?
Yeah, my question is, what organ in us, what soul power or what psychological organ attends to the thing we're deciding to focus on at the moment? The water bottle or the sound or the elephant that's not there in the room? Or the philosophical idea that was kind of spinning in my head, but now I'm going to attend to it. What is the eye that attends to those things that are always in our lives?
Yeah, very good. For one, it certainly happens within, let's say if it's in the field of sight, right? I mean, then it's our faculty of seeing, certainly. But what makes us focus on something in that field, I actually think that has to do with the will. And there's whole other kind of question whether computers can have free will, and I don't think they can, because for a lot of reasons. But for William James, for example, a psychologist, he thinks that's actually the primary thing that the will does. It focuses our attention. I think there's more to free will than that, but it is something that the will does. And perhaps an animal cannot willfully focus on something the way we can do. It's more driven by instinct and distraction and images flashing in their mind, perhaps, you know. And so in that sense, so your question, what faculty? It's the will, and often using the intellect on top of that. But that's where it gets complicated. Yeah. There's a whole orchestra in us, you know, of all these kind of faculties. You know, they operate partially independently from other, partially together. Yeah. Other questions? Yes, in the back.
Is there any way to detect from within, using my senses or using physical reality, whether
it's really hard to hear because there's so much noise.
Is there any way to detect from within our physical reality by using my senses whether something is only a material being? So, like, can I look at a computer or a person and detect that there is something more going on, or do I just have to trust it?
Yeah, you cannot literally see that with your eyesight, because our senses are in contact with material reality. That's what sensuality means, right? And our mind cannot work without the senses, right? So I cannot telepathically, you know, look into your mind. I don't know if there's something like that. People make experiments on that too, but but typically we work with our senses and together with the senses. Now, if you take these things together, if you use this whole orchestra, I think there can be intuitive awarenesses of whether there is a presence. I think as good as simulations have become, we still, I mean, with deep fakes, you can still sense there isn't something right here, you know. And now, I don't know how good simulations will eventually become, but I think we do still have an intuitive awareness, but it's a combination of our sensation and our intellect doing that, I think. Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to see what you thought about this point that I kind of reflected on based on your talk. So I think that probably one of the key differences here between, and it kind of touches on his question, between the computer and, say, a human mind would be to go back to the metaphysics of Aristotle and the difference between a natural substance and a composite of parts that doesn't itself constitute a substantial whole. Because, I mean, the miniaturization and the complexity of the circuitry within a computer dazzles people, and because it can be put in a form that operates basically arbitrarily well by a human designer, it can, I guess, sort of fool people. But you can imagine that if you blew up a very advanced electronic device into a mechanical computer, like some kind of, maybe it would be like the size of the solar system, who knows? But just pretend that we could do this. Such a machine would just be a bunch of, like gears and cogs, and they'd be touching each other. And you could look in that machine, and so like if you put like an input in it, and then maybe it like responds to you, like that new, whatever it's called, thing. And so maybe but as you put in a response, you'd be able to follow all of the circuitry that are now a bunch of gears, and you'd be able to see, like, it's like the decision tree that it's following and how it's referring back to that. So you can see in this case that the powers of the machine to generate responses really just boil down to the mechanical operation of
right,
space.
and you wouldn't even, I mean, let's say they make mathematical calculations. Obviously, they're good at that. They always have been for a long while. But if you, as like Leibniz said, if you walk into this machine, it's made large, and as you said, there are no numbers in there, right?
Well,
it's just this electronic, and so yeah, so. But just to say, even that isn't literally there. We read that into what the machine is doing, and it could do, in fact, a lot of other things that we are not aware of, or whether we misread it even. So it's not literally there, and so the same is true for our brain, in fact. What he said initially is what Aristotle says about artifacts as opposed to natural things. So, I mean, dogs, take dogs again, they are natural beings. They have a soul, they're alive, and so forth. They are a unit by themselves. A computer or any kind of a chair is made up of parts, but it's not literally a whole. That the whole is not more than its parts, if you want, as you would have for an organism. And what unifies an artifact, including computers, is the purpose that it has for us. What unifies the chair is it is made for us to sit on. It's the final cause, Aristotle would say. And that means if humanity would die out tomorrow, there wouldn't be any chairs anymore. They may still be standing around here, but there aren't actually chairs anymore. There wouldn't be any computers anymore. They're unified by their purpose for us. That's what, if you want, brings them alive, or as I said earlier, that's why we talk about them in intentional terms, but it's our intentionality that they embody. Apart from that, they are not even unified kind of things.
Okay, we have time for 2 more questions.
Good. Yes, please.
So, would self-consciousness be the delineation between, for lack of a term, like animal consciousness and like the level of their soul and human consciousness? Level and soul, or would there be any other discrepancy there? Or would it be possible for animals to some degree have self-awareness? Because there are people who do make that argument. And I'm kind of curious what your response is.
Yeah, that would be about our uniqueness over against animals. And again, I want to stress, animals are more than machines. But having said that, so the universal thought, that has to do with reason, the rational faculties, and we don't observe anything in animals that makes us think that they have that, from language to theories and so forth. That's so the universality, but there's also the reflexivity of that. Reflexivity is a complicated topic, but it really has to do with our rational thought, that we in some way can even look at ourselves as a particular from a universal perspective. So we step outside of ourselves to look at ourselves, knowing all the while that that's who we are. So we are different from what we look at, and yet the same at the same time. So I think that also I would not expect in animals. And of course, people make experiments, with mirrors. Can chimpanzees, recognize themselves in the mirror or not? The experiments don't convince me, actually, but that's a cool question of its own. So reflexivity I wouldn't expect. And also free will. Free will is sort of the ultimate kind of thing because it presupposes all the other ones. You cannot have free will if you don't have a rational mind, I think. But that's a whole topic of its own. But those would be 3 things, I think, that differentiate us from animals. Please.
Recently a lot of different applications and technology that has allowed for AI art. And recently in
an art contest, a very big art contest. A man won, and he revealed that his art was actually produced by AI.
Mm-hmm.
So I was just curious with the whole idea of imagination and the concept, how the AI.
Yeah, there's actually a whole lot of things I could say about that. And again, if you come tomorrow, maybe we can talk more about that too. But first of all, I don't think there is real creativity in AI. Because it just is parasitic on all the kind of patterns that other people already have developed. There's on a certain level nothing wrong with that, because every artist is doing that, right? I mean, no artist begins from zero. You know, you look at what other people have done, you're part of a tradition and you respond to that. So that's all fine, but you do respond to it. That is, you do something more, you reflect on that, for example. And that's where the creative step comes in. And so the true creativity, one could say, is not there for a number of reasons. Maybe leave that for a moment, but just you mentioned this contest, where somebody entered something and then said it was AI. Well, whenever I look more closely what they actually have done, it's not just the computer doing that. The computer spits out a whole range of things, but to identify the one that actually makes sense, is the human mind is doing that again. It makes sense. The computer doesn't ask whether it makes sense. It just spits out variations, and we see whether it makes sense or not. So it's, in a way, a tool for the artist. It's still the artistic maker, and for that reason, I would say, fine, enter it in the contest. It works maybe like a better paintbrush. In that particular case, I looked at that. I find it pretty empty, actually, and you can see where it's taken from, but there's also no there really. And but that's a different question. But often there's even more than that. They do photoshopping and things like that. It's not really like what people make it sound like. Yeah. But there are other kind of reasons why one shouldn't think that. Maybe let me give you one more thing. So there are three forms of reasoning, according to Charles Sanders Peirce. We talked about that earlier. You have deductive reason, right? You can deduce things. Classical algorithms do that, but they couldn't do induction. Now we have neural networks, and they do something like induction. You take all the empirical data and so forth, and you collect them, and make patterns and things like that. But what they cannot do is abduction. Abduction is a strange term. That's what Charles Sanders Peirce term is. Abduction is if you have these patterns, and then you actually have a creative new insight. That's, for example, if you develop a scientific hypothesis. You propose a new law of nature, right? That goes way beyond the inductive evidence that you have. It's a creative kind of step, an imaginative step in a way too, but intelligent step. That's the kind of step that you cannot, in principle, do in computers, because in terms of logic, if you put that into a syllogism, I don't know if you know, premises and conclusions, it's actually a logical fallacy. You would have to teach the computer a logical mistake to do that. And people have tried that, but it doesn't quite work. But we do that all the time. There are all sorts of things where we have insights that go beyond the evidence, and we have to make decisions, even driving cars and things like that. That's what Peirce calls abduction, and there is no computer way in which we can do that. And of course, that plays a role in art. Right? There's a new kind of insight, a new intuition that you have and that you want to embody in something material there. One more question? Yeah, there is.
So I think it's possible, in the future, to build computers with sensor everything mechanics, which would self-organize and grow. Okay? So I think they could imitate people. But the big question is the self-consciousness. And as we can't test, you cannot test if I'm really self-conscious or I am just a robot here. There's no way to test. We can't even formulate this question mathematically. What is self-consciousness? And I feel I am here. I feel that I will never be terminated. This feeling difficult to even to describe in words.
Yeah.
I think that's impossible by computers.
Yeah, no, you're right. That's what I was trying to say too. Yeah, indeed. Good. Yeah, I don't think I have to say more to that. You agree, right? I mean, we agree? Yeah, good. Good. Yeah.
So we have a main reading group that meets every Thursday at 7 p.m. where we discuss Aquinas' treatise on happiness. Wednesday.
Yeah.
Did I say Thursday?
Yeah, you said
So sorry. It's Wednesday. And we also have a smaller reading group that meets every other Saturday at Play Coffee to discuss F.C. Culbertson's introductory book to Aquinas and his philosophy. Please speak to me after this if you would like more information on how to become more involved. We will also have a seminar tomorrow with Father Anselm at 11:30 a.m. in Rudder 402 as kind of a continuation of this topic. We will also have another lecture coming up next month called The Unintended Reformation, How a Religious Revolution Led to a Secular Modernity, which will be given by Professor Brad Gregory of Notre Dame University. That will take place on Thursday, April 20th from 7 to 8 p.m.